If Dick Clark was instrumental in the toning down of rock and roll in the late 1950s, he was also a key player in the eventual erasing of the actual nature of 1950s juvenile delinquency from collective memory during the height of the fad for 50s nostalgia 2 decades later. His later 1970s broadcasts of American Bandstand and his Good Old Days TV specials promoted the fictional, humorous image of the greaser, a family-friendly character based on the visual representation of the 1950s juvenile delinquent, but with all hint of potential danger removed, while associated with rock and roll music. Rock and roll music, that is, that was no longer opposed by the establishment, which rock and roll originally was, but was now a part of that establishment. Background dancers on the Good Old Days are clearly seen dressed in the manner of the greaser or delinquent, but unlike their 50s predecessors, they're now smiling while performing with a people-pleasing dance style. Gone was the aggressive bravado of actual 1950s professional performance dancers. This bravado, it should be noted, would later be used by another working-class music and youth culture emanating from the streets: hip-hop. The simultaneous fear and the relevancy of the 50s delinquent was also gone, the greaser now being a beloved character, beloved while also becoming a character to be laughed at. The young 50s bad boy was now a quaint, older, nice guy. The strictly enforced dress code that Clark used to distance his fans from delinquency was not only rescinded, but Clark actively encouraged this new greaser image. Leather jackets, jeans, along with a new toned-down image, was now encouraged, something that Clark's 50s-era dancers were prohibited from exhibiting during the actual 1950s. This new benign image of the 50s greaser proved so profitable in selling both repackaged rock and roll as oldies, as well as newly recorded retro 50s recordings, often by actors and their popular sitcom characters. It was even sold to children in the way of toys and Halloween costumes, something that could never have happened during the actual 1950s. Public service announcements aimed at children even utilized the image. Of course, times change, and any means that could effectively keep children safe should be used. However, it was and is a far cry from the reality of 50s-era gang life.
Feel like new, that's what I think.
The origins of the term greaser, later to be used as a modern catch-all phrase for all 50s gang subcultures, and not referring to the racial epithet, can be traced to Chicago. The term was regional, unused by New York's bopping clubs or cliques, or San Francisco's Bart or White Shoe gangs. New York's Mau Mau's and the East Harlem Red Wings, or San Francisco's Los Gavilanes, or the San Bruno Avenue Gang, though teen gangs of the 1950s, wouldn't have been described as greasers during the time of their existence. But the rebels out of Chicago's Cornell Square could rightly be described as a 50s greaser gang. However, going by the historical record, the 1955 drive-by shooting committed by 14-year-old Clement Cookie Massis, the 1956 shooting of Warren White by Fred Cruz during a gang rumble, and the 1957 beating death of Farragut Honor Roll student Alvin Palmer, led by Joseph Schwartz, at least this real-life greaser gang could hardly be described as harmless. Incidentally, the original 1972 stage play production of Grease takes place in Chicago, another possible origin for the modern usage of the greaser term. The two wars that alternately preceded and followed the 1950s provided the origins of 1950s delinquency and the erasing of its more brutal nature from modern collective memory. 1969's Woodstock three-day concert in Bethel, New York, was the iconic counterculture's artistic reaction to the Vietnam War, the first televised war that brought the horrors and brutality of armed conflict into American living rooms on a daily basis. Unlike World War II, Vietnam polarized and fractured the nation, and in response, Woodstock was hyped as 3 days of love, peace, and of course music. Among the various acid rock and folk bands was a seemingly anachronistic neo-doo-wop group from Columbia University, Sha Na Na. Sha Na Na outfitted themselves on stage in a parody of the 1950s delinquent, or benign greaser, perhaps out of necessity, as the sharp, fashionable look sported by doo-wop groups of the 1950s and early 1960s, thin ties, suits with peg slacks and dress shoes, was now looked upon by the hippie counterculture as being too straight. As quoted in this 1972 issue of Life magazine, the flight to the 50s was a search for a, supposedly, happier time before drugs, assassination, and Vietnam. Within this context, the delinquent image and the realities of 50s gang life had to be toned down and turned into a laughable image when associated with nostalgic acts like Sha Na Na, or when used in selling rock and roll oldies collections. World War II, on the other hand, provided the causes of the reality of post-war delinquency.
I've handled lots of problem kids in my time. Kids from both sides of the tracks. They were 5 or 6 years old in the last war. Father in the Army, mother in a defense plant. No home life, no church life, no place to go. They formed street gangs.
The study of post-traumatic stress disorder was still in its infancy, and for those veterans who actually survived the war, there were among them those who often went undiagnosed with the condition, sometimes with disastrous results. One member of the Sinners, one of several New York street gangs going by that name in the late 1950s and early 1960s, related how his father, a veteran of the landing at Iwo Jima, would often wake up screaming at night, frightening both he and his siblings, and his mother. His father would find solace in the bottle, becoming an alcoholic and often verbally abusive to the wife and children whenever he actually was home. His parents later divorced, and the then youth would seek a sense of belonging, as well as strong male role models, among the sinners. This story, sadly, was all too common for inner-city teenage boys between the years 1946 to 1962. Their lives were rough, they played rough, and that mindset was reflected in the music that the inner-city gang teens listened to. Ed of the Sinners had this to say regarding mainstream 1950s teens and the music favored by the street teens of that time. People should understand that teens of the 1950s and early 60s were not all alike. I wouldn't be caught dead with a Teen Idol record, except for the fact that Top 10 Radio played a lot of it, and Bandstand had these acts on all the time. I wouldn't even know that they existed. That's one of the reasons so many of us listen to Jocko, to avoid this type of music. It isn't bad, it just wasn't our thing. Harder-edged rock and roll spoke to these kids. Soft teen pop did not. Rock and roll didn't cause delinquency, as some adults of that time accused, but it was favored by the teens of that subculture, and, in the cases of certain rock subgenres, such as doo-wop, sprang from the same streets that bred youth gangs. With American society's concern over post-war youth crime, of course, Hollywood answered with a whole genre of films, a subgenre of crime noir, the juvenile delinquent movie. Real gang teens seemed to, somewhat at least, enjoy watching the 20-something actors and even 30-something actors who portrayed them on screen, though the real teen boppers often balked at how mainstream movies represented their language, stylized as a result of film censorship, their customs, and the assumptions of how the mainstream thought gang members looked and dressed. Ed of the Sinners remarked on the black leather-jacketed motorcycle look, often attributed exclusively to late 1950s gang teens. I just figured it was some adult's idea of what a gangbanger should look like. Nobody I knew rode a motorcycle in his mid-teens. That hat might have been the dumbest thing that I've ever seen on the screen. That hat would have been considered corny in the late 1950s and early 60s. If you were caught wearing one in my neighborhood, you would have been killed and eaten right after we all stopped laughing our asses off at it. When asked whether or not the media, such as comic books, references to violent crime in songs such as Stagger Lee and Big Boy Pete, or juvenile delinquent books and movies such as The Cool World influenced he and his friends, Ed responded, "No, we didn't need the media to teach us how to behave violently. We already had more than enough crime in our neighborhood." Bay Area Poet Laureate Patrick Coonan was the former president of the Junior Jokers, a San Francisco street gang from Candlestick Cove between the years 1958 to 1962. He had this to say regarding the mainstream portrayal of gangs in the 1961 version of West Side Story. "I watched it. It was all right, a good movie. But we thought the names of the gangs in that were corny. I never knew any Jets or Sharks. I did know the Warlords, and we had a skirmish with the Lonely Ones at Galileo High School. A buddy of mine was in the Royal Lancers. Jets and Sharks? Corny." Patrick's thoughts on Grease? "Those idiots would have gotten their asses handed to them in my neighborhood." Patrick and I laughed when he related that during our phone interview, which sparked a discussion over how the mainstream now laughs at the supposed quaintness of early rock and roll culture because of the cute greaser image created during the nostalgia fad of the 1970s. Those within the vintage rockabilly subculture who I spoke to, a movement that coincidentally had begun at the same time as the nostalgia fad, had also shared personal experiences where casual, non-fans of 50s culture had dismissed 50s youth as irrelevant, while even laughing at rock and roll culture, supposedly for being too goody-goody, a consequence of that carefree and innocent image created during the 1970s nostalgia fad. It would be up to the writers within the current rockabilly subculture to show that it was in the exploring of the actual reality of 50s teen cultures, both the benign and the more tragic aspects, that the history of 1950s youth was still relevant when comparing supposedly modern issues and artistic expressions commonly associated with today.
And want to fight, we're going to fight.
Next, and our final chapter, as the gang war in Manhattan's Lower East Side reaches a crisis level, one man seeks to keep the peace, while across the country in San Francisco, news of the troubles in New York, as well as local conflict, threaten to undermine the work of local teens as city officials in San Francisco vacillate between cooperation and a get-tough policy with its own inner-city youth. And the modern rockabilly subculture brings a fresh look to 50s vintage culture for modern audiences, and bringing with it the juvenile delinquent image. Only this time, however, the actual history is presented with writers such as Miriam Linna and Martin Heafy pulling no punches. Light the Dark Streets, our final chapter in the Nostalgic Myths and Historical Reality Juvenile Delinquency series. If you haven't already, hit the like and subscribe buttons so you are notified of our new videos. And if you'd like to support the channel, $3 a month goes towards research materials, and you will have access to exclusive content. Remember to check out my other YouTube channel. This channel researches the history, while that channel explores the modern expression of that history through free vintage swing dance instruction videos and fitness videos for seniors done to a vintage rock and roll background. Subscribe to both channels and you won't miss a beat. Before we go, I'd like to thank our patrons Davina Charlotte, Dawn Ishisaki, Diane Morimune, Ron Spain, Ken Patterson, and Carol Rodriguez. Your support helps both channels to grow, and again, much love and thanks for your patronage. See you all for our next and final installment.